Imagine, for a moment, the unimaginable happens. You're sitting in a small Japanese fishing vessel in the middle of nowhere, and everything around you is completely calm. When all of a sudden the air around you seems to explode and disintegrate into ash. Now, this may seem like the opening to a horror story, but this would be the terrifying reality for the natives of Bikini Atoll and the US military alike. In March of 1954, the United States was testing their new thermonuclear weapons to determine if they could become aircraft deliverable, meaning we were testing to see if we could take nuclear weapons, load them into planes, and drop them on enemy nations, especially considering this was during the height of the Cold War, when not 9 years earlier we had bombed Japan. Now, this was a disaster. The yield was 3 times greater than the United States had ever prepared for, and it would cause the worst radioactive fallout disaster in US history. And it's not just the fact that this was a disaster. This affected hundreds of people and showed that we didn't care how much we would sacrifice in the name of progress. So I want to ask you today, what are we willing to forsake and to forget in the name of progress? So, firstly, I'll be talking about the Castle Bravo device in and of itself and kind of how this thing worked. Secondly, I will be discussing what happens when we hit that big red button. And lastly, I will be covering the very tragic, very horrific, but very real human stories that come from this incident. So to begin, what was Castle Bravo? Castle Bravo was a thermonuclear device and the first of its kind. By March of 1954, the United States was in the middle of the atomic age. Every couple years, we were making massive advancements in the area of atomic weaponry, and Castle Bravo was a testament to just how far we had come in 9 short years. Now, this device is interesting, considering its purpose to be loaded into an aircraft, because this device was absolutely massive. This thing weighed 23,500 pounds, was 14.56 by 1.37 meters in diameter. So it was very, very large. And how do you fuel this beast? With a newly developed solid fuel called lithium deuteride, which was enhanced with a substance called tritium. Now, what is the main purpose of tritium? In essence, tritium is used to make things go boom, really big. So, I want to show you roughly how this would work. So a charge would travel down the connective wiring into the device itself and travel up this channel into an actual atomic fission device. Now this would initiate a detonation, and as this detonation grows, it ignites the fuel around it and gives you a massive blast. Now this design was recently developed, and because of the way it was built, this would allow us to create weapons hundreds, if not thousands, times as large as the weapon Little Boy, which was dropped on Japan in 1945. So what happens when you hit that big red do not press button? Well, this is what happens. On March 1st of 1954, we pressed the button. We wanted to see what would happen. And what happened was not what we had expected. In fact, the yield turned out to be 3 times greater than was ever anticipated. So initially, the initial blast radius was 4.5 miles wide. Let that sink in. 4.5 miles. So if you look at this Google Earth image here of the Bikini Atoll, you see this rather large crater. That was Castle Bravo. That is the giant hole we left in the earth when we hit the big red button. And if you look next to it, there is this smaller crater, which was caused by the detonation of the Castle Romeo device, which was built very similarly to Bravo. However, it shows just how wrong Bravo went. And the yield of Bravo was 15 megatons of TNT energy equivalent. Now, to put that in perspective as best I can, that's the equivalent of digging a hole, filling it with 15 million tons of TNT, and dropping in a single match. And what happens? You get heat, and a lot of it. In fact, the blast resulting from Bravo reached temperatures that equal to that of the surface of the sun. This is very important to the story because what surrounded this test site? Coral and plant life, which was instantly vaporized into this very fine white powdery ash that felt like snow. And that is going to become so important to the story here in a minute. But moving on, the ash was not the only issue. The wind, the infamous wind, which happened to carry deadly amounts of radiation across the Marshall Islands. So if you look up here, because the mushroom cloud reached 130,000 feet within 10 minutes, you had massive radioactive impacts. So if you look at this map here of the atolls, this yellow area represents mild nuclear radiation contamination. So you might begin to experience slight headaches, you might feel slightly nauseous, you'll feel something is off. Now, if you go into this slightly darker area, you begin to actually experience migraines and fevers as well as vomiting. So your symptoms are going to build on top of each other, and they're going to get more severe the closer to the blast zone you get. Which brings me to the dark orange area pictured here. That represents an area where your symptoms are going to begin to enter the life-threatening area. You're going to experience skin burns, your hair will begin to fall out, your gums will begin to bleed, in addition to severe nausea and vomiting, and very dangerous fevers. That's not the worst of it. When you enter into this tiny little red zone, you begin to enter an area where the radiation is so severe that it instantly damages your cellular structure. And this is really bad. And without giving you a 3-hour lecture on what that actually do specifically to your skeletal system, I have 2 words for you. Bone soup. And that's what happened to a couple people. Which brings me into the more human side of the story, and the point I really want to drive home is the human side. And the most terrifying part of this specific day to me is the human stories that came from this event. Now, there was a colonel on a ship, and these ships were stationed to help measure yield. He said that his men, who had fought in World War II and had seen the atrocities of war, were so scared that they dropped to their knees and began to pray. They were so terrified of what they had just witnessed that they fell to their knees and they began to pray for all they had. And this eerily reflects what happened at the Trinity test in July of 1945, when we detonated the first ever nuclear device. The men there didn't cheer. They weren't excited for what they just created. They were utterly horrified at what horrors they had just unleashed upon their fellow man. Which brings me to another story, even more tragic and terrifying than the last one, which is the story of the Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon. Now, the men that morning were just going about their daily tasks. It was another day, when all of a sudden their captain jumped out on deck, and he said that bridge, sky, and sea burst into flaming sunset colors. That was the blast from Bravo. The blast was in fact so large that you could see it from over 200 miles away. And he would later go on to say that the sun rose in the west that morning. But these men continued along with their day. They had work to do. They couldn't just sit around and see what happened. So they continued to work, and a couple hours later, that fine white ash I mentioned earlier, well, it began to snow. And it coated these men. It coated their clothing, any exposed skin, their faces. It got into their mouths and into their eyes and into their nose. But what's heartbreaking? They didn't know what they were ingesting because they decided to lick it. The men described it as a powdery snow consistency, and they tasted it, and it was gritty with no flavor. These men had just unwillingly exposed themselves to lethal doses of radiation, and they would begin to get very sick very quickly, experiencing one of the first reported cases of acute radiation poisoning. Now, how this works. Within a couple hours of exposure, you'll begin to experience those headaches. You'll get dizzy. You may begin to vomit. A couple hours later, and this is what these men experienced, was fevers, severe vomiting. Within a couple days, their hair was falling out, their skin was horrifically burned and later remained horrifically scarred. Their gums began to bleed. And for one man, this day would cost him his life. And that is heartbreaking. Because these men, when they returned home, they were not seen as survivors. They were completely ostracized because Japanese society deemed those who'd been exposed to radiation as dirty and unclean. They were seen as contagious, so they were forced to live on the outskirts of society. And that's the heartbreak of this story, is the lives that it ruined because we didn't truly understand what we were doing. Now, I am not against progress. I am all for progress. In fact, we need to progress. I'm an advocate for society's progression. But it can't come at these major costs. It needs to be considered. We need to make sure that it is progress for everyone and not progress of the few. We can't forsake these innocent people. We cannot allow this to happen again. So, what do? We ensure that the progress we make is the progress for all, not just for a select few. And we ask ourselves, what are we willing to forget? And what are we willing to forsake in the name of progress?